When we discuss ecosystem interactions, what we have to look at are the populations of different species that are interacting within an ecological community. And so we're considering all populations that could potentially interact in a given area. This geographical area can be defined by any number of things, as large regions or as very small, secluded areas, such as that delineated by roads or housing developments or what have you. So when we look at these specific types of interactions, we've got two types. We can look at interaction as being essentially relationships between the populations, but what we want to consider a little bit more now is actually the competition. Now, competition we're going to have to be careful with, because any population cannot maintain competition long term. It's too physiologically costly for the organism. But we will look at the competition for any limited resources, and that's our big focus for this session. When we have competition, we look at it as being negative for both species. So if we look at squirrels and black bears, this might not be a competition that you would define as competition. You might think that the black bears will win every time. But if you think about them competing for acorns, squirrels and black bears competing for acorns, the black bears, yes, larger. Yes, they would probably scare off the squirrels, but who do you think it's better at actually collecting the acorns and manipulating the acorns, getting them stored away, and so on? Things like mutualism, we look at, and we've talked about before, as something that is beneficial to both. In this case, looking at the microbes in a hippopotamus stomach, no different from yours in a lot of regards. Predation, herbivory, and parasites, of course, we look at them all being positive for one, but very negative for another. So these are the kinds of interactions we have to think about in ecological systems. So there are a couple of things that we focus on. Particularly, we want to know in an area which is the dominant species. Most of the time, plants are dominant. That shouldn't surprise you. If you think about any given area, grass is typically the dominant, right, in any ecological system, or trees, or flowers, or whatever. But we can look at animals as being dominant. We've talked about corals and how they're built by animals. And in those systems, we would see very few plants, and the animals would be dominant. What we get more concerned about is when a dominant species becomes what we would consider invasive. So something like this kudzu vine has actually taken over many areas of the American South, and it is non-native to those areas. So it is what we consider an invasive species. And it's going to outcompete other things in this area. Now you see it's kind of taken over this abandoned house, but we also have to think about the fact that it's going to outcompete all plants, and it may not be a good source of nutrition for the animals that are in that area. When we look at something like this that's so dominant in the environment, we talk about it as being a keystone species. And what we look at is if you actually removed it, it would significantly change that community. And the example I want to show you today is actually of starfish. Now, many of you probably don't think about starfish as being dominant for anything, but we've talked about starfish before and their voracious appetite. And so when we look at starfish, in this case, on the Pacific coast of the United States, we look at huge numbers of starfish moving in. In particular, this is the species Pisaster, and this species of starfish fits in a very complex community structure. So all of the lined arrows here indicate some sort of interaction. So our starfish up here at the top, Pisaster, is actually eating chitin. You've seen these before. It's eating mussels. Okay? And when it does, it's limiting those predators, because these mollusks all eat something else, including looking at how they eat algae and in some cases snails and so on. Our black lines are showing us who eats who. The red line is showing that if an organism is missing, who is going to replace it. So if our mitella, it goes missing here, the Mytilus and the Balanus will actually end up replacing that. You see how these arrows go. Why is this important? Well, because if any one individual goes missing from these communities, there is some replacement factor. Someone else is going to move in. Here are Pisaster. They're moving along, eating these mussels. So the Pisaster are actually moving in this upwards direction. And they will just simply march along eating these mussels. But what's behind them? This is all algae, right? So why is there algae behind them but not in front of them? Well, the mussels are eating all of the algae. So as the starfish eat the mussels, the algae returns. Okay? So it's a very different community structure. And you can see they literally set up this line, and here's one eating. See the tube feet attached to the underside and holding onto that mussel and eventually going to open it up and eat it. So a removal of these starfish would significantly impact these coastal zones. It's what we consider a keystone species. With these kinds of keystone species in place, we actually see very little biodiversity. So biodiversity is how many different kinds of individuals or species are in a given area. So you can look at as number or percent of different species in these areas. And what we typically look at is we want to have a high level of species richness. Okay? When we look at species richness, we have to take into mind not only the number of species, but the variety of species, and actually, to a great extent, the genetic diversity of those species. Because what we look at is this interaction between different organisms. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a lot of examples of different species, a very broad distribution of species with high genetic diversity. So these would be very rich communities on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we would talk about these as being poor ecological communities. Low biodiversity, few species, clumped together, low genetic diversity. So these would essentially be clones of one another, right? We're concerned about that with disease and loss of particular organisms. So what we think about in these situations is where are the species best suited and where are they sharing the resources to the greatest extent. Because remember, we said long-term competition is unlikely to happen because it is a constant drain on an individual. Think about if every day you had to fight for your dinner. You eventually would find someplace else to eat, right? So you have to think about those kinds of interactions and why these sorts of competitions wouldn't be good. And I mean, it can be competition for habitat, it can be competition for food, it can be competition for mates, but all of these eventually are going to lead one organism to move out of an area. And they've done a lot of experiments with these kinds of competition with paramecium. And paramecium are very, very good at using resources as long as they are alone. So you see my top two in the light blue and the purple. They do very, very well. They grow to carrying capacity, right? When the line levels out, they've reached carrying capacity. That's the most their population can grow in the given resources. But if you put them together, you actually see that the light blue one is going to kind of win out, but is he really the winner? Look at how low his population size is compared to before. So not only is the purple paramecium essentially eliminated here, right? Over time, population size falls way off, but the light blue paramecium is also affected significantly by this competition. So you can actually look at sharing of resources, or what we call resource partitioning, to avoid that competition. So in this case, we have our light blue paramecium again, paired in this time with a green paramecium. These are colored only to show you the differences, of course. They're not really colored like this in nature. But what we found is in these paramecium, they've actually divided up the habitat because these guys at the bottom actually are very adapted to low oxygen. So in the bottom of this test tube, it would be a very low oxygen environment, and they can live there quite well, as opposed to the blue guy, who needs more access to oxygen. Keep in mind the top of this tube is open, so oxygen is coming in. And so they get this kind of symbiotic relationship between each other, and they've divided the resources. They're going to share the resources. Yes, their population size is lower, but they're not competing. That's the most important part. We see this all the time in nature. Birds will split out and resource partition in trees. They'll nest in particular areas, use particular foods, nuts and leaves and bugs and so on from these trees. So you see there are 3 different warblers here. They'll all inhabit the same tree because they're willing to share. So it really becomes a game of who's going to share versus who's going to compete. And really, in the long run, competition is not good for a population, so sharing resources becomes much more valuable.